Good morning, everyone. We will be getting started in just a few moments. I'd like to welcome you to the Nation Academy. We'll be starting in just a minute. Welcome.
I had a little trouble hearing you, Gretchen. Can you hear me okay?
Yes,
Okay.
great.
Hello and welcome to those just joining. We will start in about 1 minute. All right, Gretchen, shall I go ahead and start?
Yes, please go right ahead, Allison. Thank you.
Awesome. Well, hello, everyone. This is Allison Drennan. Welcome to the October Alive Academy webinar, Time Well Spent, Learnings from an English National Survey on the Volunteer Experience. We're very excited to have two colleagues join us from across the Atlantic to share some exciting research that NCVO, the National Council for Voluntary Organizations, has conducted. The research included people in Great Britain, and you need to know that includes England, Wales, and Scotland. And I think there are some lessons that we can all apply to our work. So just briefly today, we will do some introductions. We'll spend most of the time hearing the presentation, and we will have question and discussion time throughout. So our presenters today are Amy McGarvey and Sean Delaney. Amy works as a research manager and is leading on NCVO's major piece of research about the volunteer experience. She also contributes to other parts of NCVO's research program on the voluntary sector and volunteering. Sean is volunteering development manager at NCVO, and he oversees strategy for volunteer management and good practice. Previously, he was head of volunteering at Samaritans and is currently a volunteer trustee of Greater London Volunteering. Welcome to both of you, and I will now turn it over to Amy to present the research findings. Please type any questions or comments you have in the chat box, which Gretchen will be monitoring today.
Great. Thank you very much, Alison. And yeah, Sean and I are really pleased to be here to talk about our research, Time Well Spent. What I'll be doing is talking through a bit about the background of the research and some of the key findings. There's actually a lot of findings there, but we'll just give you a bit of a snapshot of some of the main ones. And then we'll be doing a quick poll to get your thoughts and reflections on a few things. And then I'll hand over to Sean to talk a bit about what the findings might mean in practice. And then we'll have some time for Q&A at the end. So just to start with a little bit of background to the research. So why did we look at the volunteer experience? So the last time a national survey had looked at this topic was in 2007, so over a decade ago. And we felt that it was important not just to look at how many people volunteer, but also to look at how volunteers are experiencing that. And that's really important, especially in these changing times. And what we really wanted to do was to remember to step into volunteers' shoes, not always to look at things just from the organisational perspective. So what our aims were really to get a rounder view of the different ways that people get involved and how volunteering fits into people's lives and the impact that it has on them. We wanted to do this across the volunteer journey and really ultimately consider what does a quality volunteer experience look like. And we also wanted to think about what that meant in terms of engaging potential volunteers. So in terms of how we did this, so as was mentioned, we did a national survey that covered adults over 18 in Great Britain, which was based on over 10,000 respondents, which we got through an online panel who completed an online questionnaire. And what I should say is that this survey focuses on volunteering through groups, clubs and organisations, which we know as this kind of formal volunteering. And whilst the focus is on recent volunteers, we also looked at those who volunteered in the past and even non-volunteers as well. It was important for us to capture that perspective. In the bottom of the screen here, you'll see a bit of the kind of process that we went through. And the key thing to highlight here is that we engaged stakeholders the whole way through the process. So it was really important for us that different people from the sector were involved in informing the design and also thinking about what the findings meant in practice. So on to what we learned, and yeah, we hope that some of these learnings might be useful to reflect on your experiences over in the US. So just before I actually talk about the experience, I just want to talk a little bit about the context that surrounds it, and really starting bigger picture with the levels of participation. We have a government survey called the Community Life Survey that gives us really useful information about the proportion of people who have volunteered in the last 12 months. But what we wanted to do was to build on that research and to look at how people volunteer over their lifetime. So what you can see here is at the broadest level that from those surveyed, around 7 in 10 said that they have volunteered at some point in their lives. And what this kind of chart shows, I guess, is the spectrum of engagement with volunteering. And you can see from those who volunteered recently to those who have never volunteered. And we can look at this kind of spectrum, not just by how many people are volunteering, but also by who they might be. And when we do that, what it really highlights is some issues around diversity. So we know that people from all walks of life volunteer, but what we can see here is that when you look at those who have recently volunteered, they're more likely to be better educated, from a higher socioeconomic group, older, and broadly the flip side of some of these things for those who have never volunteered. And some of these inequalities don't just apply to getting involved in the first place, but also once they are involved, there are some inequalities, especially around kind of leadership roles. So there are some challenges that are raised here. And from turning from who to how, what we found was that there are some kind of common ways that people get involved in volunteering. So a large majority volunteer locally, around 2/3 volunteer for civil society. There are a significant minority volunteer for the public sector. Most are kind of around, are always or often with other people when they volunteer. So these are just some kind of common ways, but the reality is a lot more complex. In reality, people combine different activities in different locations. They support different causes for different organizations and to different degrees of involvement. And this doesn't just apply across individuals, but even for one person over their lifetime, this might change. And we know that people are more likely to move in and out of volunteering over their lifetime. So this just kind of sets some of the context to what I'll talk about next, which is around the volunteer experience itself. So when it comes to the volunteer experience, what we found overall, and these are kind of our overall measures that we looked at, was that people are very positive about their experience. We have 96% who say that they're very or fairly satisfied, around 8 in 10 who say they're likely to continue over the next 12 months, and around 7 in 10 who said that they had or would recommend it. And when we dig deeper into some of the more detailed statements around kind of different aspects of their volunteering, we see a similarly positive picture, from how supported people feel to recognition as well. And this is a huge testament to the work of volunteer involving organisations that these are so highly rated. We also looked at the different benefits that volunteers felt that they got out of volunteering, and this shows kind of the most common ones that were ranked. And what we can see is that the top one here is enjoyment. So I enjoy it came out with 93% who agreed with the statements. And we know that enjoyment can mean different things to different people. For some, it's about having fun. For others who might be doing more challenging roles, it might be more about a kind of personal sense of satisfaction. But we found that this enjoyment is something that's strongly associated with both satisfied volunteers and those who continue. So whilst it's something that's quite simple, we feel that it's something that shouldn't be undervalued. The second one that was ranked there was around making a difference. And we know that this is really key to volunteers. So it's the key motivation for people getting involved in the first place. And we see that most feel that they do make a difference through their volunteering. And again, with like with enjoyment, we found that feeling that they make a difference is something that's really strongly associated with being satisfied and continuing to volunteer. It's also interesting to note that most feel that organisations do communicate with them the right amount about the difference being made by the organisation, but of those who don't, they're more likely to say that there's too little information than too much. So there could be even more done to kind of showcase the impact of volunteers and something that's really matters to them. So another theme that came out really strongly from our research was the role of connectedness, and that came in different kind of formats. So connection with the actual organisation and the cause, connection with the local community. I mentioned that that's an aspect of volunteering that's quite common anyway. But one of the interesting parts was the connection with other people. And what we saw is that over 2/3, 68%, agree that their volunteering helps them feel less isolated. But what's even more striking is that that was actually highest among younger volunteers, so among 18 to 24-year-olds and 25 to 34-year-olds. And loneliness is often talked about in relation to kind of older people, but actually recent evidence shows that it's actually younger people that are feeling it most. So in that context, it was really interesting that this came up in our research, and it raises the question of the potential role for volunteering and what part it might play in helping to connect people. So obviously, it's been a very positive picture so far, but it was really important for us in this research to explore kind of what's working less well as what's working really well. And what we found was that some groups of volunteers did feel less positive in some aspects of their volunteering than others. And you can see some of those here on the left-hand side here. And this is just to really give an overview. It's much more nuanced than that. But I think what it raises is that there are some areas where there isn't any room for complacency, and that it could be looked into further. And actually, some of the groups that are on the left-hand side, we're doing some further research at the moment into looking at into a bit more detail, because the survey in itself doesn't tell us a bit about what's going on in bigger detail. So one of the aspects that we talked about earlier in the context was around the kind of dynamic nature of volunteering. And this kind of range of volunteer journeys inevitably comes with a range of expectations, which can be challenging to meet. And one of the areas where volunteers generally were less positive about was the statement around being organised. So over 1/3 agreed that things could be much better organised. Now, what's quite interesting is that we also have around 1/4 who say that there's too much bureaucracy. And we know that there's some people who feel both of these things and agree with both statements. And we also know that the bureaucracy and formality is a bit more prominent amongst public sector volunteers. So we know that it's a bit of a tricky balance, a balancing act. And really, this balancing act isn't just something that volunteer involving organisations need to think about, but also there's a balance between individual expectations and organisational needs. So it can be a challenge. And when it comes to expectations, it's not just around organisation, but also about time. So what we found in our research was that whilst most people are very happy with the way that their time is managed when they're volunteering, around 1 in 5 said that their volunteering is becoming too much like paid work. And this was more so amongst certain groups. So it actually went up the more frequently people volunteered, and it tended to be more common amongst kind of more formalised settings like public sector or employer-supported volunteering, or where there was a paid coordinator. So this kind of led us to conclude that it's not just about how much time volunteers can give, but also about how that time feels to volunteers. And when we're thinking about how that time feels to volunteers, it's worth a little note on the kind of recognition. So what we found from our survey was that under half, so around 4 in 10 said that recognition is important to them. But actually, when we digged a bit deeper into our analysis, what we found was that recognition is something that's strongly associated with satisfied volunteers. So it may be that it's a little more important than people might be actively saying to us. But the good news is that most feel that they are recognised enough, 84%, but there's always room for improvement. And especially when you look at, if you see the chart here, the different ways that people thought that volunteers would most likely to be recognised, the top 2 things that people thought were around giving thanks. So it seems like quite a simple and easy kind of actionable way to help volunteers feel good about the time that they give. It's also interesting to note that when we asked all respondents, not just volunteers, about whether they had accessed any activities or services provided by volunteers, most, so 70%, said that they haven't in the last 12 months. So it raises a bit more generally about the kind of visibility and recognition of volunteers more widely in society, perhaps. So in terms of kind of conclusions, we really find that changing circumstances are inevitable. So we know that people sometimes have, life gets in the way and they aren't able to volunteer, and that's inevitable. But what our research shows is that it's how people experience the different elements of their volunteer journey that matters most for their overall satisfaction and their likelihood to continue. And that's true for all who've volunteered, regardless of who they are. So that kind of volunteer experience is really important for future involvement. And so now looking to the future, so I'm going to go back to the chart that I started with, which kind of summarises where people are at now. In our survey, we asked about their likelihood to get involved in the next 12 months. This was for everybody. And what we found, it makes sense, is that most those who are most likely to get involved are those who have recently volunteered, and those who have never volunteered before are least likely to. But there are some, even amongst those who have never volunteered, who say that they could be encouraged to. And when we're thinking about kind of where there might be most potential for shifting people, it may be that those who are most likely to are those in the middle, so those without kind of burdening those who are already quite involved, and those who might be quite difficult to persuade. Those in the middle might be the most where the most potential lies. But I also want to go back to what we were saying earlier about some of the issues around diversity. And so if we're to broaden the diversity of volunteers, it's really that group of people who have never been involved that we need to really engage as well. And what we found that was interesting was that of those who have never volunteered, one of the key reasons that they said that they weren't involved was that they've simply never thought about it, and also that they've never been asked. So this kind of awareness and encouragement may be a first step in potentially what might be a few steps that need to be tackled in overcoming some of the barriers that they might be facing. And when it comes to barriers and those who aren't involved already, we can't ignore the issue of time. So when you look at the key barriers to getting involved, two of the top three relate to time, and we know that being flexible with the time is something that's really likely to encourage potential volunteers. But one thing that struck us was that when you look at the actual statement for the first barrier, is that it's I do other things with my spare time. So it's more around a choice about how people want to spend their time. So it's more around providing opportunities that fit with people's lives and make it feel worthwhile. And this is reflected in the types of opportunities that people are interested in. So you can see making use of their existing skills and experience. This isn't just their kind of workplace skills, but wider skills and experience. Doing things that are enjoyable and fun to be part of, combining with existing hobbies and interests, and dipping in and out of involvement. So it's been a bit of a whistle-stop tour of the findings, and hopefully you've managed to follow us. But just a kind of few key things that we wanted to highlight. So the first thing really is that we think it's quality, not just quantity. So it's really about kind of providing a quality experience for those who are already volunteering, but also offering one to those potential volunteers to attract them into volunteering. And to conclude, what we did was that from all of our findings from the research, we kind of came up with 8 kind of key features of what a quality volunteer experience might look like based on everything that we learned. So what we concluded was that a quality volunteer experience was one which was inclusive, so it's welcoming and accessible to all. It's flexible, so it fits around people's lives. Impactful, so it really helps people feel that they're making a difference, and connected, whatever they might be connected to, whether that's the organisation itself or to other people. That it's balanced, so it's proportionate at all times, and that it's enjoyable, whatever enjoyable might mean to them. Voluntary, which might seem very obvious, but that it's their own free will to us. And finally, that it's meaningful, so it really resonates with their values and their priorities. So that was kind of in conclusion that we kind of concluded that a quality volunteer experience is time well spent, which really captures all of those things together. So that's the kind of end of the findings. What we wanted to do was take a quick breather, give you a chance to kind of get your thoughts together. And yeah, if you have any questions that you're thinking, please do type them over so that we can have a look at those. But we've also got a quick poll in the meantime.
Yeah, I think, Gretchen, if you're there and able to pop the poll up, then that'd be great while people are thinking about their questions too. Lovely. So thinking back about those 8 areas that Amy mentioned just a second ago, do have a think about perhaps how would you rate your organisation's ability to do these particular things in these areas, and that will help us focus about kind of where we'll talk about the good practice elements in just a moment. So first of all, have a click there on how inclusive you think you are. So do you think you do this best, that you have shown some improvement, that you're at the beginning of this, or is this a priority area that you need to work on? And just take a few minutes to have a think about each of those 8 areas. Also, if you have got any questions, feel free to let us know about those as well, just by typing them in on the screen there. And Gretchen or Alison, I don't know if you've got any questions there for us.
Yes, we've got a couple of questions, and I just want to encourage people to go ahead and vote. I see some folks have voted. Please continue to do so. We'll leave the poll open for just a moment more, and we can share some results.
Great.
I'd like to hear one of the questions now, or do you want to wait until after the poll?
Yeah, happy to take a couple of questions now as well, while people are still finishing off the poll.
Okay. Well, one of the things I was wondering, just in the difference between Great Britain and the United States, and I'm wondering if there are any stereotypes about volunteering that seem to be a challenge for a lot of organizations?
Stereotypes. Maybe about the demographic profile that they kind of tend to be, which I guess our research really might confirm in a way, that kind of older, kind of from a better educated, from a certain, I guess, demographic in society is probably the first thing that comes to mind.
Wonderful.
Sounds good. I think one of the big surprises for me, I know, in looking through this research, was that that age range of the younger groups, with volunteering having the biggest impact on their levels of isolation. I think in the UK, certainly we hear a lot of discussions around older people feeling isolated or feeling lonely, and what we can do to support them. But seeing young people talk about it quite so much in this research, and the impact that volunteering is making was quite a big one for us, I think.
Thank you. Okay, a few more, a little bit longer to leave the poll open. Thanks for everybody who has voted so far. Another question is on the connection to other people being important to that 18 to 24 and 25 to 35 age categories. Is there indication in the research on whether they are looking for offline or online connection, or more digital or face-to-face within those age?
Yeah, we can't tell from the research findings, I guess, whether that is, whether it's an online or offline connection that they're looking for. We did ask some questions around kind of how much they're online generally, and we found that kind of older people tend to be a bit more offline than online, but in general, actually, it wasn't as probably the differences weren't as marked as you might expect. But I think it is just that, overall kind of connection to others. And I think younger people, what we find is that young people are more kind of looking to meet people as part of their, as a kind of motivation for their volunteering as well. So I guess, that doesn't necessarily relate to online or offline, but I think it's kind of related to that motivation for wanting to meet others and have that social element to their volunteering.
Thank you. I'll go ahead and close the poll, and we'll share the results. I'll just go over them really quickly, and then I'll turn it back over to Amy and Sean. So on the number one, inclusive, everybody said we've shown improvement, which is good. And then we've got a little bit of mix on being flexible. The same for impactful, and it looks like they've many people have started a plan to improve. And being connected as well as showing improvement. Balanced, everybody feels like they're showing improvement. Making things enjoyable, also a good mix there. And in that voluntary piece, it's a little bit of everything. And then meaningful. We do this best and we're showing improvement. So those are good results. Thanks for the feedback, everybody.
Thanks. Yeah, that's great. That's looking really great. So there's perhaps some bits around connectedness there that we can certainly pick up. I've made a quick note of that. So shall I move us into the second part of the presentation then, and talking about some of the practical implications?
Yes, please.
Lovely. Well, hello there, everybody. My name's Sean Delaney. I'm the Volunteering and Development Manager here at NCVO. And a part of my role is to learn from all of the great research that Amy and her team do, and see what we can do to turn it into practical guidance and support for volunteer managers across England or across Great Britain. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to talk about those 8 sections in particular that we mentioned a second ago. So thanks for your feedback on those. But before I do, I guess one of the things that we think about a lot here in volunteering is around expectations, and that managing volunteers can be a lot about understanding and managing expectations. And I think for me, the research has been really great in letting us know, as Amy mentioned, about how people are volunteering and what people expect from their volunteering, and how that might link into their satisfaction or not. And I guess when I think about expectations, also about expectations changing over the years. A good example that I think is not just expectations in volunteering, but expectations that we all have in our day-to-day lives. And a really good example is how people communicate. So if we think about, I don't know, 20, 25, 30 or so years ago and how people communicated then, perhaps the main methods of communication people used were perhaps writing letters, or they would have a telephone, but that telephone would be connected to the wall by a wire. And if people needed a certain piece of information, they might need to, I don't know, write to somebody in art or go to the library to find out that information. Whereas if we zoom ahead to today, the expectations that people have from life is that they're going to be able to communicate a lot faster and get information much, much faster than before. To the point where most people carry around a device in their pocket that not only means that they can communicate with somebody straight away via email, WhatsApp, Facebook, Twitter, text message or telephone, but also they're able to access a wealth of information immediately as well. So I think that's a really good example about how life has changed, and perhaps if we think about how life has changed for people and how that transfers over into volunteering, that's quite a useful way of thinking about this. So when I think about volunteering, I think about it as that relationship between what an organisation might want and what an individual might want from their volunteering. And where volunteering is at its best is that crossover in the middle, that sweet spot where both the organisation and its beneficiaries and the volunteer get something out of it, and it becomes truly a two-way relationship. But I think over time, perhaps what we've seen is what people want has just shifted slightly because their expectations from life and their expectations from how we live with more opportunity, more technology available to us. Things have shifted slightly. So when I think about Amy's research, it's for me really useful in thinking about, well, okay, how have those expectations shifted, and how can we as organisations or as volunteer managers think about how we shift what we want or how we offer that to volunteers so that they're still attracted to come and volunteer within our organisations. So with that in mind, I'm going to think about how that might have shifted, reflecting on what Amy said, but think practically about how that impacts on these 8 areas. So the first one we're going to talk about is inclusivity. And I think inclusivity is where people pretty consistently scored 3 out of 4 in the poll just a moment ago. But for us, inclusivity is about offering inclusive volunteering opportunities and experiences, and that being important for good quality volunteering. Amy showed earlier on in one of the slides that there's naturally a group of people that tend to be most likely to volunteer. So those being women, those being from a higher socioeconomic background, for example. I think for us as well, one of the most striking things is that idea of education level or income or socioeconomic background being one of the major areas where people are or are not giving their time to volunteer. So I know that when I talk about this with other organisations, we try and dig into that a little bit about how does our practice as volunteer managers affect whether we're excluding people from volunteering. And there's a bit of research, again, available on the NCVO website from Amy's colleagues, that talks about the difference between regular formal volunteering and informal volunteering. And at the top line there, we can see that with regular formal volunteering, if somebody over on the left-hand side is more highly educated, perhaps to degree level or above, they're much more likely to volunteer than those over on the left-hand side in a formal role, of those with no formal qualifications. However, if we change that from formal volunteering to informal volunteering, what we see is that difference is a lot less pronounced. So still 36% for those with a degree level or above, but there's much less of a difference for those with no formal qualifications. So for me, I think when thinking about Amy's results and different types of people that get involved, it's worth thinking about just the way that we structure volunteering roles and opportunities can have a big impact on whether we're welcoming or whether we're excluding or putting off people from certain groups. Next one, flexibility. So, creating volunteer journeys that can adapt to a variety of volunteers and their life circumstances. So naturally, we're going to have a picture of a cat on the screen. So when we think about flexibility, I think on the poll, this was where there was a few organisations felt comfortable with it and a few weren't that sure. When we're thinking about flexibility, we're thinking about trying to fit volunteering around what people are doing in their lives. And we believe through Amy's research and other research that people have more opportunity and more demands on their lives than ever before. As Amy pointed out, people responded about not volunteering because they do other things with their time. People are more able to go on holiday these days, or more able to connect to information on the internet, more likely to have Netflix in their own home, so it's easier to do other things rather than volunteer. So we work with organisations, some organisations, to think, well, okay, how can you perhaps even combine volunteering with what other people want to do in their lives? One really good example of a bit of innovative micro-volunteering is with an organisation called Be My Eyes, for example. So Be My Eyes works with blind or visually impaired people and gives them an app on their phone. So if they're out and about doing whatever they're doing in their lives, and they're struggling to, they're struggling to read a packet in the supermarket, they can go onto this app that instantly puts them in touch with a volunteer. And that volunteer is, again, just going about their day-to-day life, that will get a notification to say, actually, somebody needs your help just for the next few seconds. And the volunteer that needs help can take a picture or use the camera on their phone to show what they need help reading or interpreting for them. Maybe it's print just too small. And the volunteer, for those few minutes in their day, can provide that volunteering, can provide that support to this person that needs it. And we're starting to see that, I think, with more and more volunteering roles now in providing that flexibility. Another good one in the UK is community first responders, where volunteers in their communities, particularly rural communities, are trained up in life-saving first aid skills, so that if an incident happens in their area at any time, they can perhaps be alerted by the ambulance service, so that that volunteer can go and deal with the incident while waiting for the ambulance to arrive. So again, it's volunteering that just neatly slots into that person's life. Lovely. So let's move away from the kitty cat and on to the next one, impactful. So we know that good volunteering maximises the impact volunteering has on volunteers and those that they help. I don't know if you discuss this a lot in the US, but certainly in the UK, we talk a lot about impact and impact measurement generally across our organisations, but also in volunteering. And one of the ways that we talk about this and that I get across in the slide is we spend a lot of time talking about demonstrating impact. But as you can see on the graph there, we perhaps only spend a tiny little bit of time actually demonstrating impact. And I think for me, one of the things that really rings true from Amy's research is perhaps what we know of people's expectations changing over time more generally. If we think back to 30 or 40 years ago, people tended to sign up to a job for life when they were going into work, and they might expect to have great loyalty to the organisation that they're working with. However, these days, with millennials or those that have been born more recently, we know that they're much more attracted to a cause rather than an organisation. So they want to know what difference they're making to that beneficiary, to that individual. And we're seeing them wanting to see that impact through a lot more through the choices that they're making and what they're doing. So if you're able to demonstrate that impact more so and feed back to the volunteer, this is the difference that you made on this person, they're perhaps more likely to be satisfied or attracted to your organisation. Next one, connectedness. So strengthening the connections that are at the heart of volunteering. Now, this one, I'll pop up the stat that Amy mentioned a second ago. 18 to 24-year-olds and 25 to 34-year-olds are the groups most likely to agree that volunteering helps them feel less isolated. So somebody kindly asked a question around stereotypes just during the middle of the presentation. I think for us, this helps us get over the stereotype a little bit that younger people are attracted to volunteering for their CV and older people are attracted to volunteering because to meet new people. Actually, there are those benefits that different age groups want from volunteering, and connectedness is one of those that spans the age ranges. Have a little sip of water there. So for me, as a volunteer manager and as a practitioner, I think this is an excuse for a party in a way, or it's an excuse not to try and downplay the importance of putting on that social event for volunteers, or finding a way to connect volunteers through social media when they're volunteering. That volunteering is inherently a social activity, not an isolated activity. So finding ways to be able to support that connection is time well spent. Using the title of the research I wrote there. Balanced. Amy's mentioned this as well a little bit earlier on, that it's a bit of a conundrum for volunteer managers, that over a third agree that things can be better organised, but around a quarter agree that there is too much bureaucracy. So when we're thinking about this, we wonder whether this is more about appropriateness of formality. So we think perhaps that volunteers who are volunteering with an organisation that's involving children or vulnerable people, they're expecting organisations to be much better organised. They're expecting to have certain checks carried out with them, and for them to go through quite a robust recruitment or induction process to get in. However, on the flip side, if a volunteer is just giving half a day to raise money for your organisation, they don't want to have to spend equal to that amount of time filling out forms to go and volunteer. So we think that making sure that the level of organisation around volunteering is really appropriate to the actual volunteering role that's being undertaken. So I think we've got about 3 more to go, if I remember right. The next one is about enjoyability. Trying to make the experience enjoyable for volunteers as we can. This one, I think, was again a little bit controversial for us when we pulled out the results of the report, because for some volunteering roles, it's, I think, very difficult for volunteers to acknowledge that it's enjoyable. In particular, we have, I don't know, the example I tend to use is the Suicide Helpline in the UK. If you're volunteering on a suicide helpline, is it in bad taste a little bit to say that you're enjoying your volunteering? Actually, what we're finding out is no, it's not in bad taste at all. And actually, volunteers need to feel that what they're doing is enjoyable, or at least it's satisfying and it's fulfilling, and it has that. What I like to think of that warm, fluffy feeling that you get from volunteering, that is really quite important. From a practice point of view, naturally I put a sausage on the screen to talk about this, and for those vegetarians that are listening, we'll say that this is a vegan sausage as well. But this is thinking about when you're selling difficult volunteering roles and trying to attract people to volunteering roles that might be a bit tricky or a bit difficult. It's okay not necessarily to talk about the volunteering role, but talk about the sizzle. There's the phrase in marketing, sell the sizzle, not the sausage. So sometimes with difficult volunteering roles, it's okay to sell the enjoyment factor and the fulfillment that somebody will get from a role to attract them into the role, rather than focusing on the negatives or the difficulties that you might have in a volunteering role. And what this research is telling us is that it's that volunteers find that enjoyment a very integral part of their volunteering. Next bit, voluntary. Now, I think for this one, I think most people on the poll felt that they had the voluntary nature of their volunteering nailed, which sounds brilliant. I think what we found in the research, though, is not all volunteers necessarily feel that way. And some volunteers are starting to feel that volunteering feels a little bit too much like work, and actually they don't really like that. So the tip that I guess I've got for volunteer managers in that way is similar to this picture on the screen, that if something looks like a duck and walks like a duck and quacks like a duck, well, then it's probably a duck. And the same could be said of volunteering and work too, that if something looks and feels like work to a volunteer, their satisfaction levels might start to dip after a while. So making sure that there's that sense that somebody's there because they want to be there and not because they feel obliged to be there is a big important part of volunteering. And let's just talk about the last part then, meaningfulness. Supporting volunteers to give time in a way that's meaningful for them. And for that, we're going to go back to a cat picture. So you might recognize Grumpy Cat off of many GIFs and pictures across the internet. This really, I suppose, for me, in the research, is a lesson about thinking about your specific volunteers and thinking about what is meaningful to them and how can we demonstrate that meaning and that sense of recognition for the volunteering that they're doing. And for me, it's the stat that Amy mentioned earlier, that only 4 in 10 people felt that recognition was important to them in volunteering. However, the most satisfied volunteers were those that were volunteers that were recognised in some ways. So for me, I don't know, you could say, do volunteers lie? Well, perhaps not that harsh to say that, but certainly what volunteers tell you might not necessarily always relate to how volunteers experience their roles. So if you've got volunteers protesting that they don't need any fuss, or you should focus on your beneficiaries rather than the volunteer. Actually, deep down, if you don't give them the certificate or if you don't thank them, it's noticed by volunteers. I think in the report as well, we found that the way that most people said that they wanted to be thanked was just a thank you from the organisation, as simple as that. Which is why things like celebration events or thank you cards are perhaps a great, simple way of expressing that gratitude to volunteers. So that's been a bit of again, a tour around those 8 points based on the research, but thinking practically what we might do as organisations to adapt our practice and think about what we're doing. So again, now really over to you for any questions that you might have. Happy to take those now. In a moment, just after that, we'll give you the link of where you can download these resources, all for free and freely available on the NCVO website. Any questions at all?
I've got a question, Gretchen. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Oh, yeah, lovely.
Oh, okay.
You go ahead.
So I read in the research summary that disabled volunteers were more likely to be online than non-disabled volunteers, and so around the point of inclusivity, do you have any examples of organizations that are doing that really well?
I'll have a think about that one. I know that, Jamie, do you want to talk about the finding in the report first, and I'll think about some examples?
Yeah, I think, I think thank you for highlighting that one, because I think it's, we've been talking about kind of connectedness, and I think that point is really important that came out, that disabled people more likely to be online, because it may be that that is kind of one way that that some of that connectedness could be facilitated through an online platform.
Yeah, I'm just trying to think about examples as well. I think the main examples that we're starting to see is around the use of social media generally to appeal to different communities, not necessarily just disabled people, but also to reach out to communities that might have been left behind a little bit with volunteering, that haven't historically gotten involved. But I don't know, it's one area that I think with the Time Well Spent research, we're looking at digging into particular areas through a number of thematic reports, and the deep dive that we're going to be doing in the new year will be around diversity, to look at those areas a little bit more.
I'm sure in kind of years to come as well, again, kind of thinking more generally about online, as well as disabled people versus non-disabled people, we found that those who had kind of started volunteering with their organisation in the last year or so were more likely to be online than those who had volunteered kind of further back in time. So it may kind of point to a bit of a trend going forward. So I think, yeah, it doesn't answer the question for now, but I think it will be something that is definitely one to watch. And I think, some of the things that are becoming more common are, around kind of digital mentoring and things like that as well. So
Yeah.
it'll be interesting to see how some of those things develop.
I wonder if there's something about accessibility of devices as well. So what is it, only a year or two ago that more people started accessing the internet through mobile devices rather than laptops or PCs. So I wonder as devices become more accessible, if that might be more appealing to volunteers to give their time in different ways, and in particular perhaps disabled volunteers. But thanks, yeah, good question, thank you.
Yeah, no, thanks. I think that's really exciting opportunities there.
Yeah, absolutely.
Gretchen, I have another question if no one else has one.
Go ahead, Allison.
Okay, so I was intrigued by the duck and the conversation around volunteering versus paid work. And I'm wondering, in England, do you have written guidelines around what makes something paid work or volunteering, or how do you kind of separate the two?
Yeah, I think there's a couple of ways of looking at it, kind of a legal way and a slightly more social or psychological way. So the legal way in England, we kind of break work, if you like, or an employment contract down into three parts. The first part is have an agreement from both sides, but you get that in volunteering and in work, so that's fine. That everyone is agreed and signed up to this being a relationship. But the two factors of work that are not present in volunteering, one is around pay, and the law in the UK is quite specific that as soon as payment is started to be made, then it moves from volunteering into work. But the final point, and this is the point I think that is slightly more social and slightly more open to volunteer managers, is around a sense of obligation or mutual obligation. So as soon as somebody feels obliged or committed to do something, or they have to do something, otherwise they get penalised, or it becomes quite a burden on them, but they feel like that they're trapped and they can't get out of that. That's quite binding. That's quite contractual. So both from a legal perspective and from a kind of a social perspective, we would see that as feeling much more like work. And when we're thinking about the duck, I think it's more those features that organisations are starting to see volunteers be less happy about. Volunteers that feel like they have to be somewhere, that they have to turn up at 4 o'clock at a particular time every week. It's that sense that feels much more like obligation, like commitment, like work, and less like, hang about, I'm giving my time to volunteer here, and I should be able to be here because I want to be here, not because I feel like I have to be here. So yeah, I think money has an element in there, but it's that mutual obligation that is applies pressure. I think another nice way to think about it, and the way that I tend to talk about it, is the difference between expectation and obligation. And I think there's a subtle difference there that sits on either side of the line. So it's fine to have mutually agreed expectations with a volunteer, that this is what we expect you to do with us, and this is what you can expect us to give back in return. But I suppose it's when that tips over from expecting into feeling obliged to do something where it becomes a bit problematic.
And I just add to that as Sean mentioned, we're doing these kind of focused reports on some of the things that came out of the main time well spent data, and the one that we're doing at the moment is on public sector volunteers, and we did focus groups with them, so we got to kind of talk a bit about this kind of whole what does too much like paid work, what does that mean to them, and yeah, just really echoing what Sean just said, it's really around this kind of sense of obligation, and what we found also was that kind of coupled with that, where people don't feel appreciated and valued, that really kind of tips them over the edge in terms of feeling like paid work. So that kind of combination of obligation but also not being appreciated, really, that's where it really starts to feel like paid work. And that appreciation isn't just generally, but also recognition that they're actually a volunteer, that they're doing it in their free time. where they don't feel like that, then that tends to be what we found in our public sector research, especially among volunteers who are in quite formalised roles. So we had magistrates and governors, for example, or those kind of quite formal roles, that especially among those that they felt like where they're not appreciated, and it's really actually quite similar to some of the roles that are done by paid staff, that then it becomes a bit more problematic.
Great. So it's a really interesting point and a really interesting question. I think it's something that probably will change over time as well, about even what do people think about work these days too. We're seeing, I guess you're seeing similar trends in the US, but the rise of the gig economy, where people are much more likely to dip in and out of careers, or sign up to short-term contracts, or do things like let out their apartments on Airbnb, or become an Uber driver, or something along those lines. It's a changing world.
It is, for sure. The expectation versus obligation helps to kind of clarify it in my mind.
I think, yeah, I've had a few discussions with volunteer managers over the years. Another way that I tend to think about it as well is the difference between asking for a commitment and being committed to a volunteering role as well. So if an organisation is asking for a commitment from a volunteer, then that starts to feel like an obligation, because the requirement, if you like, or the motivation is coming from the organisation. Whereas being committed, actually that's a motivation that comes from within the volunteer themselves. So being committed is absolutely fine, and it's great that you have committed volunteers to your organisation. But when you start requiring the obligation as an organisation, that's where the element of obligation comes in and feels tricky. But yeah, great. I could happily talk about this sort of stuff all day, but yeah, any other questions perhaps along those lines, or any of the other points that we've discussed over the last 45 minutes or so, 55 minutes? Okay then, well, I think if there are no other questions, then what we can certainly do is pop up on the screen about the research reports.
Yeah, so as Sean mentioned, on our NCBO website, we've got what we've covered today is really just a snapshot of what is actually a very large piece of research. So we've got our main report, which is about 100 pages long, but we've kind of designed it so that it's quite easy to kind of dip in and out of. It's around different themes. I would recommend, if you want to go into some detail looking into that. At the end, it also has a whole section on kind of implications for practice and policy as well. And for those who don't want to go into a 100-page report, there's also a summary report that we've got there as well. And as we mentioned, we've been doing some reports focusing on some of the key themes that came out of the original research. The idea with these is really to explore in a bit more detail some of the things that have come out, especially where they've been a bit more challenging, or where there seems to be some issues, just kind of trying to understand that a bit more. So we've already released our first report, which was on employer-supported volunteering. I'm not sure what you call it in the US, but it has lots of different names here, corporate volunteering, and employee volunteering, and so forth. But our research on that kind of looks at, it builds on the time well spent data, but we also did some research with charities, but also with employers as well, looking at it from different perspectives. And I just mentioned that we're doing one at the moment on volunteering in public sector organisations, and we're due to publish that in November. It's all of these things are on the Time Well Spent page, so you can see that at www.ncbo.org.uk/time well spent, and yeah, they're freely available. So if what we've discussed today has been of interest, yeah, please do have a look.
Tell your friends.
Great. Well, thank you so much, Amy and Sean. This has been a really awesome and succinct presentation of 100-page reports, and I encourage everyone to to at least look at the summary report. And also, as Gretchen said, the slides will be available for you to look at. We will send out a survey after today's webinar, so please take time to fill out that survey. We do look at it and provide feedback to the presenters. Just a couple of upcoming Alive Academy opportunities. November 4th at 2 p.m. is a new member welcome webinar that'll give you some information about all of the Alive opportunities. November 15th at 1 p.m. we'll have a webinar on practice and research featuring Emily Bromett-Bauer. And oops, this didn't get, yeah, sorry, this didn't get changed, but we will have a December 4th webinar on a different topic. Also, the Volunteer Management Hybrid Conference is coming up October 22nd and 23rd. Still a short time to get plugged into that, so check out the Alive homepage. And again, Amy and Sean, thanks so much for being with us across the time zones, for preparing that that presentation and adapting it for our audience. Really appreciate your time and the time you spent putting into this.
No worries, it's great to be here.
Yeah, thank you very much for having us.
Thank you for having us. Yeah.
All right, everyone, have a great evening. Have a great day.